and welcome along to Writer's Routine. This week we're chatting to the science fiction author Paul S. Edwards, who's just published the first in a brand new series. It's called The Triton Run. We talk all about his twisting and turning path to publication. Also, you can hear why, as someone fairly busy, he doesn't only write when he can, but also simply what he can.
If I simply try and write from beginning to end, that's when I do have problems. You asked me earlier on about, are the points where you do hit problems and things that slow you down. And I think that can be the process of having to go from A to B to C. So the one thing I've found that really allows me to sort of work quickly is the fact that I do jump around a lot. And then once I've written the other bits, then I might go back and that scene will either fix itself because I'm coming at it with a fresh set of eyes, or sometimes if it's a scene that you've sort of really struggled with, that's sometimes a sign that, that scene wasn't needed.
And we really get into it with the plotting and planning of sci-fi. You can find out what he thought could happen in reality when dreaming of the story.
So I then started to think, well, what might the world or the solar system look like at that point in the future? And that's when all the different layers started to sort of appear to themselves. So, first of all, it's science fiction. So yes, I am going to have some aliens of some sort. It's going to be a first contact story. So I started to think, well, how could I incorporate that into it? And then I started to look at the other levels of what would society look like, what would be the political background, the economic background, what drives people.
It's all happening in a brand new episode of Writer's Routine with Paul S. Edwards. Yes, welcome along. This is Writer's Routine. Thanks so much for finding us. My name is Dan Simpson. It's a podcast where we take a look inside an author's working day. We find out how, when and where an author gets everything done. How do they plan their life to give them the best chance of getting words down on the page? And with today's guest, which you'll hear about, there's not too much planning involved there. We'll come to that in a sec. Now, on my Substack newsletter last week, which you can find online, writersroutine.substack.com, the link is in the episode notes too. Last week, I asked questions about what you want from the podcast, who you like hearing from, what genre do they write in? Is it bestsellers? Is it new debutantes? Is it full-time writers or ones who have made it work with everything else happening in a busy family home? How do they carve out that time? If you've not seen that, I'd love to hear what you think. And I've had a good amount of response as well. A lot of emails have come in, so thank you very much for that. If you've not clicked onto the Substack yet, please do give it a go, just because I'd really like to know what you think. And as I said in the post, by the way, this is not a referendum, right? I'm not David Cameron panicked by another tub-thumping writing podcast in the rearview mirror. I just want to know what you think, so perhaps I can steer the future of what's happening. We'll see how that goes. It's writersroutine.substack.com. Now, for those of you who answered that you wanted to hear from writers of a unique genre who managed to make it work around about a billion other things, then let me present to you today's guest. Paul S. Edwards is a family man, 2 young children, a lawyer now, a published sci-fi author too. He's done it through Northodox, who are an indie publisher who specialise in voices from the north of England. You can hear how he found them after a few near misses, even one along the way that got him dreaming of a blockbuster Hollywood movie series. The thing with Paul is that he doesn't just write when he can or what he can, as we heard a second ago, but also where he can. Paul is perfectly fine with typing away before football matches or at gigs or whilst binging a TV show with the rest of his family. And, well, for that reason, I think this is the first episode of Writer's Routine where we don't actually get a proper writer's routine. You'll find out why. Don't worry, there's still a lot that you can take away from this episode. Paul's new novel is The Triton Run. We talk about taking an epic idea and turning it into reality, planning sci-fi, how he makes it unique, his own, inspired by but not totally derivative of what's come before. Also, he talks brilliantly about the passion of getting it out there and the future of his writing and making it work for him as an author. Thinking about not just branding the novel, but also branding himself as a writer, marketing what he's doing. One of the ways is by launching a website for quite a short space of time. You can take a look at that right now, paulsedwards.com. And we discuss what's happening next. Now he's got his first out, what changed about writing the second when he suddenly had a publisher very keen for it. It's all on the way. I think you'll really enjoy it with Paul S. Edwards, and we start as we always do with what he sees around him in the place where he sits down to write.
There's two answers to that. I think there's the answer about where I write most of what I write, which can be done anywhere, and then of course there is actually the computer where I do finally sort of edit and put everything back together again, and that's the office. We've got a home where I work from home. I mean, I'm lucky in the sense that when lockdown hit and we all changed to working from home, we sort of had a home office sort of kitted out. So it's a really, really nice office and lovely furniture. The view, however, is not as good as some of your other guests who talk about, having views of the countryside or cliff tops and so on. The view from my office is actually the bins outside the side of the house. So it's not quite as luxurious. But apart from that, it is a lovely room, and I've got sort of my work computer there, my personal computer there, shelves with, books and CDs and so on. And that's sort of where the book comes together at the end in terms of editing all the pieces together and so on.
In that space around you, because I know that you're writing science fiction, so a lot of it is world and universe building. What is there any of that paraphernalia around you? So kind of maps, I don't know, maybe notes or post-it notes, anything like that?
I don't have anything hanging around that sort of relates to my work. That's all sort of either in my head or saved elsewhere or an email and so on. But I think the one thing that is sort of useful that might make someone think, yes, this guy writes science fiction, is the fact that on the shelves next to me, I've got a row of, I suppose I would call them science fiction art books. Sort of John Harris, I think it's Chris Foss, and other art books, you sort of see from various movies, the art of June or whatever it might be, and they're sort of the books I sort of occasionally turn to when I'm sort of short of inspiration, or I think I need a really cool location for something that I've planned but I'm not sure where. And sometimes you can just sort of flick through hundreds of images, and they can sort of spark the imagination going.
Is any of your early stage drafting done there?
Not really, no. Because it's rare that I actually get the time to sort of sit down and have an hour or two in a run. So most of the drafting is done on the fly, I think is how I'd probably describe it.
So if you're on the fly, what are you doing it on? Is it you and a laptop, and simply everything has to be either on there or in your head?
It's mainly on, I would guess, my phone or my iPad. I'm always jealous when I sort of listen to other episodes, other guests who describe their sort of, where they're full-time writers, and they can sort of spend, the day sort of framed around writing and get, hours to sit at their computer. I have to sort of squeeze it in amongst everything else, and I suspect most budding authors and even a lot of published authors are the same. So for me, really, it is a case of if I get 20 minutes, 30 minutes, maybe an hour, it's to type whatever's in my head into a device, for later use, for stitching into the book later. I mean, that can literally be, sat in front of the television while we're watching something. I might have my iPad open in front of me and I'll just type away. Or it can be sort of quite a lot of writing done in, I don't know, probably stranger locations. I go to the football, and because of traffic and parking, I end up arriving sort of an hour early. So I get an hour at the football where I'll sit and type notes to myself at the football. Go to concerts and so on. Again, you end up getting there long before the band come on stage, and I'll sit on the floor and write a chapter sort of there and then.
Well, it doesn't sound ideal to, I guess, many people, but is this something that you're perfectly comfortable with? Are you just absolutely able to sit down in the floor of a big arena and just, start typing away?
Yeah, I think so, because I don't know whether it's a strength or a failing in my sort of the way I am, but I mean, the ideas are always floating around in my head anyway. So if I get that time, then I just have to go for it, because otherwise I would get nothing done. And it's amazing how a large proportion of my actual sort of first drafting is done that way.
If you, because you work, you're a lawyer, so that's a job that you don't kind of fall into, right? You've wanted to do that, you've worked very hard, and that's where you are. So, could you see your writing life in any other way? Like if the kind of series blows up or does pretty well, would you want to kind of create more time to sit there for hours just staring at a screen in the office trying to bash out a first draft?
Well, I think, I spend my whole life sat in the office or at my desk bashing out words anyway. The nature of being a lawyer is that most of my work, is drafting papers, and actually one of the things that I have had commented is that a lot of my actual legal work is quite creative, in terms of trying to take the client or the opponent or the judge on a journey. So there are certainly parallels, but yes, obviously, if writing did go well, then I would absolutely embrace the opportunity to devote more time to it.
What have you learned to do that helps you be very efficient with the small snatches of time? I mean, if it were me, it would take me quite a long time to switch my brain on. I'm watching the football. I'm getting ready to do that. I want to drag myself away. I need to get into the zone. What do you do to just help that?
I think rather than doing something, I think the main thing is that I do or don't do is that I don't worry necessarily about the quality of the first draft, because ultimately the story's got to get from A to B, and I can't edit it and make it into a great story without actually having some words down. So actually, I'm sort of quite relaxed. In that, if I get that spare minute or we've chosen a TV program that doesn't, necessarily sort of excite me, I just start typing away. And then, it is funny, you look back at it later and sometimes you can clearly see I was distracted and I must have been enjoying the television because some of the words aren't great or I've gone off at a tangent. But no, it's just a case of I just have to make myself get on with it.
But you're now on a deal where Northodox Press are publishing 2 of your novels, right? So the first book could have been written very flexibly whenever you had snatches of 20 minutes here, half an hour in front of the telly there. But now surely you'll need to be a bit more focused and regimented with your time.
Yes, this is the big change, to be fair, and it's been quite a daunting prospect. The first book was written over the course of, I don't know, probably talking about 5 or 6 years, and I wrote 3 completely independent books during that time. And as you say, there was no time pressure or anything like this. But obviously, when I signed with Northodox, who have been absolutely brilliant in terms of being supportive, the idea came up, well, why don't you write a sequel? And yeah, it was sort of the prospect of, well, okay, well, you've got 12 months, to write that second book. And I'd never had to write, to a contract, to a deadline before. But if, I aspire to be if not necessarily a full-time writer, but a more serious writer, then it's something proper writers have to do. So yeah, I have certainly felt the added pressure. And I think whereas in the past, as you say, it's too distracting to focus on the football or, I won't bother writing tonight, even though I have got a spare hour. Now, I just can't let myself do that. The sequel was due 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's not quite there, but that they are being really supportive about it, and it will be finished probably in the next couple of weeks. But yeah, it is a very different discipline, trying to force myself through the word count, forcing myself, to get to the end.
So when you knew that you would have to make that change, knowing how you work and how limited your time can be, how did you go about planning that? Was it kind of word count per week? Was it just trying to force yourself to be very efficient with the bits of time that you had? There must have been some structure there that you had considered.
Yeah, I wish there was a precise structure. It has been more a case of throwing myself into it and knowing that roughly, a science fiction book, it's going to be between 100 and 110,000 words. And over the course of the last, when I say it was within 12 months, in reality, it was probably about 14 months or something like that. And I've effectively just tried to keep on track with, I'm 6 months in. Thankfully, I'm at 50,000 words, so I know I'm roughly where I need to be. And that's the way I've tried to pace it. But I think it's sort of, I don't know, I think it's a bit more beyond a simple word count, because there are some bits where you can fly through 10,000 words. And then I found over the last 6 weeks that the word count has not ground to a halt, but I've reached a really important bit towards the end, and I have just slowed down because that's about making sure the story's right.
And if you wrote the first one over the course of about 5 or 6 years, I guess you were kind of redrafting as you were going. Now moving to the sequel and having to get that off in a year, whatever it was, how much have you had to factor in time to edit, but also making your first draft as clean as possible?
Yeah, I still don't necessarily worry too much about it being too clean, but I think also, to be honest, I'm a better writer, because when I first wrote the first draft of the Triton Run, obviously I'd never written a book before, so I think I ended up writing 166,000 words, and the book that's coming out is about 106, 108,000 words. But since then, there's also 2 books written in the meantime, and I think I've learned and improved my improve my craft. I think in terms of sort of being a clean draft, I seem to have stumbled onto a process where particularly with this one as well, it's sort of, I wrote the first third and then could see the way ahead, but then went back to the beginning and worked through it again to make sure I was in the right place that I wanted to be. And then again, I got to about 60,000 words, 70,000 words. And again, at that point, I went back to the beginning again and began and worked through it to make sure that everything was sort of lined up for the conclusion, because thankfully the ending is the one thing that I've always had in my mind from day one. So I think there is a structure there, and it's a structure that I've learned over the last few years.
Is there any social pressure when you're with mates or maybe with family and you go to watch a show, go to watch the football, and you're whipping out your phone and trying to get a few words down?
No, not really. I mean, to be honest, for example, the football example, because I get there early, there's not usually anybody else there. So I tap away until, my friends or the people who sit by me and so on, until they actually turn up. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly obviously been noticed in some social situations. Oh, Paul's got his phone out. And I think a lot of the time people think I'm on, Twitter or something like that. But in fact, I'm typing ideas away. But yeah, I do tend to try and do it when it's not impinging on family life, I would say.
You mentioned that there is time when you're in the office, and that's when you are editing. You are kind of bringing all this stuff together. How much of that is a dedicated time that you have allotted yourself to, kind of bring all these scrabbly notes across your phone and across the iPad together?
I don't sort of set a particular time, like, I don't know, Thursday night or anything like that. But there's certainly a sort of a more determined way to try and sort of get that structure in place. So what tends to happen is every couple of days, I'll, whether it be sort of late at night after everyone's gone to bed, or we've got 2 little dogs who quite like waking me up at 6:30 in the morning, even when I'm on holiday or it's the weekend. And I'll use that time to then go back through the emails that I've been sending to myself that have bits of text, and then I'll copy that text into Scrivener I use. And that's when I start sort of pulling it all together. And it's only really on the last stretch, when I'm doing a final sort of edit, spell check and so on. That's when I'll actually sort of say, right, okay, for the next week, every night at, 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock or whatever, I'll be going into the home office and focusing on it.
I know that you always wanted to write, and you've always read science fiction. What was the moment? Like, because you got a family, you're like a lawyer, that's a busy job as it is. You're having to snatch these bits of time. What was the moment a few years ago, whenever it was, where you thought, oh, okay, I'm going to give this a go. I'm going to take time away from friends and loved ones, and like a bit of an inconvenience at time, because I just want to get this story down. What was that moment?
I'm not sure if I can think of the moment when I actually decided, yes, I was going to write. I mean, I wanted to, write since I was a kid. When we were growing up, I was sort of old enough that people didn't have PCs and computers in those days. When we were growing up, my dad worked in education, and during the school holidays, he could bring home a computer from whatever school it was he was working in or whatever. And then for that week, because we had a computer in the house, I'd start trying to tap away. And I've always had that sort of that desire. But as I think, rather than necessarily something that made me think now's the time to write, it was more a case of I just sort of got reinvigorated in terms of my interest in science fiction. And that happened probably 20 years ago, a book called Revelation Space by Alistair Reynolds. And it was the first time I'd sort of sat and read a book straight through in the course of like 2 days or something. And that sort of reinterested and reinvigorated my love for science fiction. And then after that, it was more a case of just finding the right time. And then, of course, children came along, which, as you can well imagine, sort of takes away time. So it's just been a case of waiting for the right moment, and also, to be honest, the right idea. Once I had the idea for the novel, it was like, okay, well, this is what I've got to write. I think everyone's path to publication is different, to be honest. I don't think there's any one set way. My way, I wrote the book, and as I was finishing it, I'd never queried or knew how publishing worked. So I did lots of online research about how it all worked in terms of you need to get an agent first and so on. And I told myself that, I would try the traditional route. And then if that didn't work, then perhaps I'd look at, self-publishing sort of further down the line. But I know that to self-publish, I think it's quite a different discipline, because you need to understand advertising and Amazon algorithms and that sort of thing. And I wasn't prepared to sort of find the time for that, because finding the time just to write was hard enough. So I did want to go down the traditional publishing route. So I spent probably 18 months querying literary agents. I seemed to do pretty well in that I had quite a good hit rate in terms of requests for full manuscripts. A couple of very near misses. I'd get a lot of good feedback. I'd one, I'll sort of call them a Hollywood agent without naming them, who rejected the book with lovely comments and then emailed me a couple of weeks later saying I might have made a mistake. Is the book still available? So for the following sort of few weeks, I was sort of convinced they were going to take the book and it would be sold and there'd be movies and all that sort of stuff. That didn't happen, but I did, again, got lots of positive feedback and encouragement. And while all this was going on, I finished my second and third book, and then just purely on social media, I saw Northodox, who are very much an up-and-coming independent publisher. The name sort of suggests it, that they are supportive of northern-based writers. Or people from the north originally, and I queried with them direct, because of course with most publishers you can't. You have to go via an agency, and they said yes, we'll take a punt on you, and while you're at it, we'd love you to write the sequel.
Did that process at the end of kind of getting in touch with Northodox and it all happening, was that quite speedy?
It was speedy in terms of them saying, yes, can we see the full novel? It was far quicker than I expected. It was speedy in terms of them saying, yes, we'd love to sign you. But then the actual signing process did take several months. But I presume that's probably no different to going with one of the big publishers as well. Sorting out contracts and taking advice on it takes time.
Well, you're as a lawyer, I imagine you didn't need an agent for a lot of that contract business.
I would have quite liked to have had one just to bounce ideas off, but what I did do, and I would recommend to any sort of author in that situation, the Society of Authors is worth joining. I sent them the contract, and they sort of sent it back and said, and to be fair to Northodox, I'm not just sort of saying it, they are nothing but fair with their authors. A few suggestions for amendments were suggested by them, which were good ideas. As you say, having a legal head, I'd spotted a couple of issues myself. There were a few emails back and forth, and we agreed terms. It wasn't difficult to agree terms, not by any stretch. It was quite a routine process, really. It just took time, but that's because they're busy with the day-to-day work of the books that were already lined up, and that was the only thing that dragged out, rather than it not being important, I think.
So it's almost pointless to ask you about any proper routine, because it's clear that you just, it's not like you wake up every morning and your day is centered around the writing. It's the reverse. You have to kind of snatch these moments where you can. So it's pointless wasting time doing that. So what I will say though is in having written the last two books, well, almost finished the second, and what have you learned about what you need to write best? So if the idea isn't coming, if you are struggling, if you can't get into the zone wherever you are, what have you learned that just helps you out?
I think the biggest problem I found is that if I simply try and write from beginning to end, that's when I do have problems. You asked me earlier on about, sort of are the points where you do hit problems and things that slow you down. And I think that can be the process of having to go from A to B to C. So the one thing I've found that really, really allows me to sort of work quickly is the fact that I do jump around a lot. So if I've got a scene that's really, really difficult and I'm struggling with it, then the next time I get 20 minutes, actually, I'll just know I've got another scene to write, several chapters ahead or whatever, and I'll just do that. So I'm constantly jumping around, and then once I've written the other bits, then I might go back and that scene will either fix itself because I'm coming at it with a fresh set of eyes, or sometimes if it's a scene that you've sort of really, really struggled with, that's sometimes a sign that, that scene wasn't needed. So it might be a case of actually that scene then gets deleted and the bits of information that are needed from it get used elsewhere.
Let's talk about the novel then, the Triton Run. Just tell us, Paul, about the first moment that the idea for this sweeping epic came into your head.
I was reading an article on the BBC. There was a story about, and I think they were described as ferrymen, and essentially they were sort of pilots who deliver small sort of propeller type planes or personal small jets all around the world. And it sounds as if these guys are basically sort of daredevils in that, a small plane that clearly won't fit on most boats. You can't stick it inside another plane, but these planes are bought by, millionaires who have islands in the middle of nowhere or whatever, or a plane needs delivering to Australia. And somehow someone has to fly this plane across the ocean, across the whole world or whatever to deliver it. And this article was describing, what a dangerous job it was and how they had to do repairs on the fly and land on, sort of random tropical islands to sort of fix the plane and take off again and refuel. And that's just sort of lit an idea as to, what would happen if that happened in space? Someone's got to deliver something to the end of the solar system, and they've got just sort of do it on their own. And that was the first idea that I thought that's interesting, and then everything else sort of then layered on top afterwards.
We say everything else layered on top. I mean, the thing with sci-fi is, by its nature, it's normally grand, it's sweeping. Yeah, you're writing a few hundred pages, so it needs to be a bit focused, right? You've got this idea of people delivering stuff across the universe. Then what are you thinking next? How big are you making this project to start with?
I mean, compared to some of the other things I've written, that will hopefully see the light of day in the future, which are sort of grander and, across sort of a true space opera across the galaxies or whatever. This story was based in our solar system, so it's still a huge canvas to write on, but in that sense it was limited. But once I started to think of that idea, you're right, I couldn't simply have that as a story because in itself, it would need to be pretty special. So I then started to think, well, what might the world or the solar system look like at that point in the future? And that's when all the different layers started to sort of appear to themselves. So, first of all, it's science fiction. So yes, I am going to have some aliens of some sort. It's going to be a first contact story. So I started to think, well, how could I incorporate that into it? And then I started to look at the other levels of what would society look like, what would be the political background, the economic background, what drives people. And that's when some of the sort of political angles, in the story, there's sort of kidnappings of presidents and there's terrorism in space and things like that. And I was trying to sort of build that into it to sort of make it a far deeper story than a simple adventure of going from A to B.
These ideas could go on forever, right? That's the joy of a sci-fi. You've got, the solar system to play with. And how do you know when enough is enough? Is there ever a time when, you have an idea of what could happen and you think, it's probably not going to fit into this one?
There's definitely a risk of being too much, and I think that's what happened with the first draft. 166,000 words. It was on an even. I mean, this story is a multi-point of view story. There's lots of characters. They all end up sort of roughly in the same place at the end, but there were too many different strands, too many characters, and that's when I realised I did need to strip it back. So some of it got removed, and some of it's been reused in the sequel. There were other characters where effectively I merged a couple of characters. I thought, we don't have the time and space to have two little stories or little avenues going off at the same time, so I would do that to merge them. And ultimately, I think there's a lot crammed into the 108,000 words, and it is, and hopefully I got the balance right.
You can hear more from Paul in just a sec. I'm very quickly popping by to remind you that if you're enjoying the show, if you've learned anything from today's episode or the 350 plus episodes, I think now, that we've had with so many different types of writers, well, you can become part of our community and perhaps say thank you to the show for doing that by backing us over on Patreon or Ko-Fi. If you would like to regularly support the show, perhaps make a monthly pledge to become part of the community on Patreon, where you get merch, bonus content, and there is even a way for your book to sponsor the show on there too. You can do that, patreon.com/writers routine. It doesn't cost a lot. As little as you can give goes an extraordinarily long way, I really promise. That's on a monthly basis. You can also do that as a one-off. You can send a tip my way if you fancy on our Ko-Fi page, ko-fi.com/writers routine, and that's a one and done if you would really prefer that. Honestly, I would just like to see you there. I love the fact that what I'm doing is really inspiring your work too. So that's on Patreon and Ko-Fi. You can get a link to those wherever you're listening to the show. So let's get back to it with Paul S. Edwards then, chatting about his new novel, The Triton Run. We discuss how he's looking forward in the future, moving on to balancing with a touch more finesse his work, his family life, and his writing. Now he's finally got the Triton Run out there. Also, we hear how he's branding himself and the steps that he's taking to make sure, as a writer, he is being marketed effectively. And we jump back in talking about, well, sci-fi as a genre, because it's big, it's grand, it's sprawling. There's quite a few different types of it out there. So how did he know what needs to be in a sci-fi story?
Science fiction is full of these traditional tropes, as you say, aliens, little green men and so on. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to try and sort of come up with different, locations, different ideas, concepts that were new, that would hopefully make people think, wow, that's not been done before, or it's not been done in that way. So, for example, much of the story is set around Neptune. There aren't many other stories that are set around Neptune. Part of the story is set around Mars, and we know there's lots and lots of, films and stuff around Mars. That's fine. But I wanted to have the different angle to it. And again, it was things like different technologies and so on. The part of the story is set on the space elevator. Again, it's not an original idea, but I'd not seen anything where there was, terrorism involved in space. So I tried to sort of, some of the ideas are traditional, some of them are new, and hopefully they sort of all been melded together to make something that's, the same but different, if that makes sense.
And by nature of science fiction, the balance is the science and the fiction, right? So as far as we know, there are no aliens on Mars or Neptune. You can't set foot on half the planets in the solar system. What rules are you setting for yourself on how truthful you can make this, even though you're traveling into the future? So who knows, how much you allowing yourself to slightly bend what could be possible?
Yeah, in terms of science fiction, obviously there's a sort of genre called hard sci-fi where everything has to be, scientifically possible as far as we understand it now. And I did try to sort of move more towards that direction. So in terms of like the technology, the space elevator, theoretically that is a possible structure. I went to the trouble of watching various documentaries about how these are being, planned and sort of tested, and the materials that are going to be used to construct them are designed. In terms of the locations, again, I did quite a lot of research on, the various asteroids and moons that are used. I looked at the sort of photographs, the data on what the sort of, what it's like actually being there. So it wasn't simply a case of, they landed on this planet or that planet. It's all sort of based with a certain high degree of fact. And in fact, one of the funny things in terms of timing is that everybody for the last 100 years has thought that Neptune was blue. If you were to Google now, the word Neptune, most of the images of the planet are blue. So in my book, I described Neptune as blue. And then literally the week after I'd handed it in, there was an article that came out and said, effectively scientists have got it wrong in that the photos that were taken by, I think it was Voyager, they'd had some filters applied to them, and actually it's not that blue at all. It's almost pale white. So we had to. Thankfully, there was the time to go back and change that within the book to make it accurate.
What about language? Simply the words that you're using on the page, right? Because a plot that takes you across the universe like this does almost doesn't need to be lost in verbiage, but sci-fi does very well with prosaic language. And yet I know that, it must be quite hard to think of wonderful, pretty prose when you're sat there waiting for, Liverpool to come out at Anfield, right? Like it's how much did you think about the words on the page and what's coming next?
Probably not as much as others. I don't think I'm a literary writer in that I'm not obsessed with having, flowery language and the sort of descriptive words you're sort of alluding to there. I think for me, it's more important that, the story entertains. And if it can entertain, and sort of link a few ideas back to real life and make people think, then that's obviously great. But for me, entertainment and sort of making sure the plot's right and the characters are interesting is more important than, a particular sort of use of, terminology or phrasing.
You've done something interesting with publication in that you've made a very short-lived website, right?
Yes.
Tell us about the idea of why you've chosen to market it like that.
Well, I'd say it's only a small part of how we're going to market the book and market myself. But when I was doing the research to try and find an agent, to try and find a publisher, I obviously spent a lot of time online looking at websites and looking at the websites for, established authors, partly to find out who their agents were, but also just to try and sort of understand how they work. And I think the one thing that came out is that as well as marketing the book, I think it's also important to market yourself, particularly to try, if I'm going to turn this into a sort of a career of sorts, it's important that people actually sort of get to see, well, who am I? Why do I write, what interests me? So I decided that it would be useful to have a website that would, cover all that. I'll sort of probably update it once or twice a month. And I did that. Probably one of the reasons why I missed the deadline for handing the book in, because over Christmas I spent a couple of weeks teaching myself how to do it. Watching YouTube videos. I built one that didn't look right, so I deleted it and then built the one that you currently see. It was hard work, but now it's there. It's worthwhile, and it's relatively easy to keep tinkering with and adding articles to.
I know that you're also a member of a writing group. Now, I am not. I've spoken to a few authors who are. But what does that community give you? Why does that, when you're starting out as an author particularly, what does the ability to have other people around you as you're writing do?
The timing was really strange, actually. I was invited to join the writing group the same week that Northodox sent me their contract. And I actually wish I'd been a member of it for several years earlier. But anyway, so the way it works is that there's probably about half a dozen members of the group. All of us are sort of ambitious, want to be authors. A couple in the group have contracts. A couple don't. Some self-publish, but we're all trying to go in the same direction and get books out there. And what happens is every sort of 2 to 3 months we all share some work, so everybody will share up to, I think it's 10,000 words, and then we all take a month, 6 weeks or whatever it might be, to then read it and provide feedback. And I think, to be honest, it was the first time that I'd actually had feedback from anybody. You'll have heard and I'm sure know all about imposter syndrome. So there was no way I was ever going to share my drafts with my family or my friends, because you would fear the reaction you might get. So the only people who'd actually ever seen my writing had been agents and, of course, Northodox. So it was really refreshing to share work with other fellow writers, and it was the first time I'd ever actually had proper sort of line-by-line feedback.
I often speak to people on the podcast who will complain about the baggy middle of writing, and I know that's whenever I'm writing, and I struggle, it's about 35,000 words, slap bang in the middle. If you're writing 166,000 words, how tricky was that halfway through, or did it change the viewpoint of how you write because you were doing so much of it?
I think it did, and I think there's no doubt about it. I think I talked earlier on about having a stock take, as it were, at sort of 30,000 and 60, 70,000, and I think that's definitely true. And I think at that point there is the danger that you go off in totally the wrong direction, and certainly what I've done previously, and I think we'll continue to do, is at that sort of point, actually, that's the time to go back to the beginning, because that's when you realise, I didn't really need, that tangent or that character, or that scene was too long or wasn't working.
The thing with sci-fi is what inspires, sci-fi more than anything, I think, is probably other sci-fi, right? Usually ardent fans of it tend to write it itself. So how do you go about making yours different? How do you go about making your lead character completely different from, say, a Luke Skywalker, something completely alien, forgive the pun, to those things? Because it must be quite easy for your influences and the stuff that you read and are quite fanatical about to creep into your stuff.
I think you sort of it's a great question, because it is so true. I think certainly when I was younger, any drafts of stories that I made, which are all thankfully long deleted, there is a tendency to go down that of the sort of the male hero, the Luke Skywalker character who comes in and saves the princess and saves the universe, like Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers and so on. They all follow a trend, but I think the one thing I wanted in my work was for it to be different, to be more grounded in realism. And I think as part of that, what I realized was that we're all flawed in our own different ways. And so a lot of my characters, as I was sort of thinking, well, I need a character to do X or Y, I started to look at their motivations and what their previous life experiences brought to the table. So all of my characters have all got their own baggage, and some of that baggage, is in relation to things like addiction, or one of the main characters, has a history where they were labelled as a war criminal for something that they'd done. That sort of influences the way they act now. So I think it was important that I do try and sort of break away from those traditional tropes, because otherwise, as you say, there's hundreds of books out there that do exactly the same thing.
And moving forward, you've got the 2-book deal with Northodox. You're just finishing the second. The first one's coming out. You've got other books that you've, dabbled in over the last few years. But do you go on? Do you do more sci-fi? Do you dream of another universe that you can set stories in? Do you slightly change tack?
I think I can only write in science fiction. It's the sort of area of media where I like watching, the TV shows, the movies. It's the only thing I pretty much read, apart from an occasional, crime thriller on holiday or something like that. So I think, there's no doubt that I'll be sort of staying in the, the science fiction, space opera space, and the 2 other books that I've got. Once I've handed in the sequel to the Triton Run, I'll be back to sort of finishing and updating those. So hopefully I've got it'll be 4 science fiction books effectively lined up.
And any possibility that you could be a bit more regimented with any routine and writing more than just snatches before a local gig?
Well, we'll see. I mean, thankfully, my children are more grown up now. They're sort of heading off to university later this year. So, hopefully that will sort of bring a change in lifestyle, to the family. So hopefully, there will be more scope for, well, yes, I can write early on a certain morning, or on a Sunday morning I can write, rather than taking children to sports events or whatever it might be.
And that is it for this week's episode of Writer's Routine. Thank you so much to Paul S. Edwards for coming on the show. You can find out more about the Triton Run published by Northodox on his website, which you heard about in the show, paulsedwards.com. I will stick links wherever you're listening. You can back our podcast to Patreon and Ko-Fi. Again, links are in the episode notes. As I say, I'd love to hear what you think about different writers that you want to hear from. You can do that by subscribing to my Substack page. It's absolutely free, just more or less weekly newsletter letting you know what's happening behind the scenes, what's going on in the Writer's Routine world, universe perhaps. It's writersroutine.substack.com. Take it as read. Every time I say a link, it's in the episode notes wherever you're listening, right? And I will see you next week with a brand new episode of the podcast. Until then, thanks for listening.